Last week, I shared a sermon about how, as we find ourselves inundated with hard news, it's okay not to feel okay, and that resonated with people. So let me say that again. It's okay not to feel okay. Well, speaking of illness, it was back in July of 1722 that a pastor by the name of Edmund Massey delivered a sermon about illness to his church in London, England. The words that Massey shared in that sermon were of enough consequence that he and others believed that they deserved to be printed, and so a local printer got involved, and soon Massey's sermon had been turned into a pamphlet. Now, like I said, this sermon touched on the topic of illness. And so Massey chose as his scripture text Job chapter 2, verse 7. So went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with boil, the sole of his foot unto his crown. Now, Massey understood this biblical story about illness as a clear indication that when people get sick, it's either because God is punishing us or testing our faith. Now, I suspect you could find a Christian or two these days who expresses something like agreement with that idea, even if it does seem theologically problematic. And speaking of problematic, at the conclusion of his sermon, Massey insisted that since God sends illnesses according to God's will and purpose, it is therefore wrong, unnatural, sinful even, to subvert the divine will through the tricks of medicine. Massey's sermon was entitled Against the Dangerous and Sinful Practice of Inoculation. Inoculation had been introduced as a means of curbing the effects of smallpox a few years earlier. But to Massey and others, this new development in medical science was seen as a threat to God's created order. If God wanted you to die of smallpox, they insisted, then that's precisely what you ought to do. Now, maybe this story helps you understand a little bit about why the good people at Queerly Beloved like to say that bad theology kills. I don't know how many people heard and took the deadly theology of Massey's sermon to heart back in 1722. Thankfully, his biblical objections to what was at the time a new trend in medicine didn't prevent inoculation from becoming more and more popular, more and more advanced, and saving more and more lives. My guess is when a COVID vaccine is finally available, if some preacher were to stand in the pulpit and say it was against God's will, that it was sinful to artificially alter one's body in the interest of one's health, people would almost universally disagree. Nobody would be so foolish as to make that kind of case. Now, what I think that means is people of common sense and good faith can recognize that however God created us with an agency that allows us to be co-creators. God made us to be makers. The biblical poet confesses in Psalm 139 that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, that God knits us together inside and out, and that therefore God is always near us, always intimate with us. And as St. Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, we created things tend not to pop into the world ready-made. Paul is speaking in that chapter about how God grows the church. It's like a garden, he says. He, Paul, did ministry that was metaphorically like planting a seed in the soil of a garden. Have you ever done that? I used to do that when I was a little girl on my grandparents' farm, where rows and rows of neatly planted seeds were sown. Every now and then, a grown-up would entrust into my little hands a dozen or so seeds, and so I planted. And then, Paul says, another person, an evangelist named Apollos, came along and he did ministry that was metaphorically like watering those seeds. I've done that part too. You know, if you only plant and don't water, you're not going to have much of a garden, right? Well, ultimately, and most importantly, Paul says, the growth itself is a gift of God. It is a grace. The church then is like a field grown by God the Creator. Now that's a beautiful image. And I believe it's made even more beautiful by the affirmation that God does not work alone. Creation in all of its glory and wonder is an enterprise in which God invites people like you and me to be co-laborers. We, Paul confesses in 1 Corinthians 3 verse 9, are God's co-workers. Now, one of the sayings I've repeated again and again and again during these past several years of ministry goes, God is always up to something. God is always up to something, always at work, in ways that are clear and discernible, in ways that marvel and mystify us, in ways that we don't even sense. God is always up to something. Now that's good news. And there's more, you see, for the God who is always up to something is always inviting us to be a part of that something. In some small way, perhaps. But the invitation is there. You are always being called to join in work that is like planting and watering. You're always being called to join in the work of creation and recreation. Because God does not work alone. Because community seems to be the primary way that God chooses to work in this world. And so when Mary Wortley Montagu, whose husband was the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, observed around 1717 that smallpox was being contained in Istanbul thanks to Muslim doctors practicing inoculation, what she was seeing was an example of how human beings like you and me can join in the divine work of healing and giving fullness of life. And so she got involved in that work herself. She came back home to England and she said, you know what? We ought to try this around here. She wasn't subverting God's purpose as the bad theologians like Edmund Massey preached. She was joining in the work that God was doing to rescue people from a deadly disease. God was at work. A bunch of Muslim doctors and the wife of an ambassador got involved in that work. And as a result, lives were saved. God is always up to something. We are always being invited to join in that something. God doesn't work alone. One of the most touching videos on YouTube is a short clip of an award speech given at the Daytime Emmy Awards back in 1997. Now, the winner of the award, the giver of the speech, is Fred Rogers, longtime host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on public broadcasting. Rogers, who was an ordained Presbyterian minister, seemed a little out of place in front of that giant auditorium of people. But he stood up on that stage and he spoke with such loving sincerity that by the time he was finished, a lot of people were wiping tears from their eyes. And incidentally, if you want to look up this clip, and I'll put it in the comments below, I highly recommend having a tissue or two in your hand. All of us, he said, have special ones who have loved us into being. And then Mr. Rogers invited the room full of soap opera stars and talk show hosts to stop, to be still and silent for 10 seconds, and to think about those special people. Those people who have loved us into being. And that sounds like God's work, doesn't it? To call you and me, to call creation into being out of love. Well, beloved, God does not work alone. God invites us to join in the work, to plant seeds, to water seeds, to love one another into being. And we get to be a part of it. One of the more frustrating expressions of intolerance and disapproval I have encountered in the time since I came out holds my gender transition in the same regard that Edmund Massey understood inoculation against disease back in 1722. The idea is if someone like me is assigned a male gender at birth, if some parts of our anatomy and biology suggest that we are male, and if we are socialized as such, all those realities must necessarily reflect God's creative purpose. And to question those realities, step outside those realities to change those realities must, some people say, be contrary to God's will. Now, it's this way of thinking, this way of judging transgender people in our experiences, that has led some within the church to say that we are threatening to undo the very order of creation. Pope Francis, who's been all over the news this week for suggesting that same-sex couples should be entitled to civil unions, not marriages, by the way, is one of the loudest voices to say such things. Now, I think it's wonderful that the Pope wants humankind to address the problems of human-created climate change or the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But I think it's disgusting that he believes people like me belong on that same list of global threats. Transgender people are not like weapons of war. We are not like an environmental crisis. We are not threatening to undo creation itself. No. Rather, we are joining God in the act of creation. We are planting seeds. We are watering seeds. We are delighting in the growth that God gives. Transgender people like me are blessed with the gift of loving ourselves into being, of seeing what God is up to, even when nobody else can see it, and saying yes to it, of saying, yeah, I am going to be part of that. Heath Ackley is a retired theologian and professor of religion who now works with the suicide prevention organization Trans Lifeline. He's also a transgender man. He has written about how, as he contemplated his own gender transition, he had to fight against that sense that he was intended to just conform to the role associated with the gender he was assigned at birth. I tried to pass as the woman I was told I should be, even when I was physically dying from the side effects, he said. Eventually, his fight became too much. But when he gave up that fight, he heard God calling him. I stopped wrestling with God, Ackley said. And the words of Psalm 139 flooded my mind. I praise you, because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Powerless in the face of God's creativity, I thanked God for my being whatever I am, even if I myself don't understand it, Ackley wrote. I love that idea, that you or I can become powerless in the face of God's creativity, overwhelmed by the notion and the conviction that we were created for so much more, that we can become co-workers with God, making something new out of something old. Because of God's overwhelming creativity, we can confess that we don't have to be what we used to be. Now, that's true for you, regardless of who you are, regardless of your orientation or experience or gender identity. There is grace, there is gospel in this confession, beloved, that God is always up to something, and that God is always inviting us to be a part of it. And so, beloved, let me ask, what is your part going to be? Amen.